Welcome to today's Building Forward. I'm so excited to have two guest stars with us here on Visionality's Building Forward. We have James Joyce, famous of Coffee with a Black Guy. Thank you for being here, James. And my colleague, Llewellyn Summers, who is our operational and hiring manager. And we're going to have a really great conversation today about how to make diverse hiring practices permanent instead of performative. And so I want to start out by acknowledging that Llewellyn and I are two white ladies talking about diversity hires, and that's kind of weird and kind of awkward. And so I wanted to lay that out at the beginning, and I know we're going to use it as a jumping off point for this conversation. And I also want to preface this that my job as a leader and a CEO is to find the most talented, impressive, smart people and hire them and get them in a room together. And so that's what I've done here. And I'm going to shut my mouth and let these two incredible people have a conversation about hiring. So with that, let's take it away.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. Llewellyn, you want to kind of give us a preface, or do you want me to just go ahead and dive in?
Yeah, I guess the preface that feels most important is something that you said when we were preparing about get comfortable with feeling uncomfortable. And in preparing for our conversation today, I have been so uncomfortable. I have literally, had moments just in the middle of the day, not doing work, where I've been thinking through, this difficult conversation, and I'll just start sweating. I'll just lay it out there. I'll just start sweating thinking about it. Like it is, it's a hard thing to talk about, right? And we are trying to be vulnerable in sharing Visionality's experience, because we are coming from it from a place of not at all being where we want to be, which is like sharing a failing of ours, and it's embarrassing in a lot of ways. And so I'm just going to lay all of that out there from the start.
And that's
great.
Kind of why this is the perfect conversation to have, because it's so easy to make a presentation and say, look, we're done, right? And when we were preparing for this, I was really pushing James, like, I need 5 takeaways that every person can attend this and then like put them into action immediately. And James was like, well, no, that's not going to happen. And so we just decided we were going to show up and be our imperfect, vulnerable selves and use ourselves as an example of a work in progress. And yeah, no better person to do it than James.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, no, thank you, and I appreciate that, Llewellyn. I think that's a, that's the real, like that's an authentic step forward, right? Mm-hmm. Understanding where you are, where you want to be, and kind of what that gap is. I'm going to give you all a quick little snapshot of kind of what Coffee with a Black Guy is, why I started it, and then we're just going to dive into addressing some of that awkwardness. So I started Coffee with a Black Guy back in 2016, just for the reasons that you expressed, is that, a lot of folks are new to conversations about race. And it's my full belief, as someone, as I like to call it, reverse engineering. You hear, Llewellyn, what you just shared, someone who's lived that life on a daily basis in almost every room that I've walked into. I learned how to get comfortable being uncomfortable, right? Mm-hmm. And that whole sweaty feeling, that anxiety, like that's it used to be day by day. I got used to it, and so I kind of bathe in that at this point. But that's why these kind of conversations are important to move us forward, to recognize kind of where we authentically are, and kind of what would move us forward into a better spot. Specifically looking at issues of hiring. I've done, over the past 6 years, I've done facilitating conversations for communities, for small businesses, for larger corporations and companies, nonprofit boards, school districts, across the gamut of institutions who were looking to just have authentic conversations. We can, read the books, you can watch the documentaries, you can go through all the trainings and have lectures. But this is an opportunity. We're really going to encourage you to engage and ask your questions and fumble through these things, because you may or may not have an opportunity to do that in the future. A few basic guiding principles that I wrote out when I first started working with Coffee with the Black Guy is being respectful, some basic rules, right? Be genuine, be willing to listen, be willing to feel something, and that one's important. Because this is really an interactive experience, whether you're asking questions, engaging or not. The interactive experience is often happening in our head and in our hearts all the time. And then the final thing is just don't seek to dominate with your story. Give space and share space. We've got a limited amount of time, and we know that our bandwidth is limited as well. So I wanted to make sure that we make the time and engagement useful. And short of that, Coffee with the Black Guy is just that. Make sure you've got your beverage. I've got mine. It happens to be coffee this morning. No judgment if it's not. But you know, just moving forward and having a conversation like you're having a cup of coffee at your corner store, but really having a targeted conversation about how can we move some of the things beyond just performative, because it's gonna feel performative at first, and it's gonna appear performative at first. But how do you get from performative to something that's more permanent? And we can excited to dive in and talk through that. I appreciate, Emily, you kind of setting the stage and saying that that this is an awkward conversation for you all. It's not awkward for me. You know, I've been doing this. It was awkward for me when I was you know, learning the language to have these conversations, and it was a lot of anger and frustration and not knowing how to, you know, express that. But at this point, yeah, there may be awkward conversations, but that's where, you know, growth is happening. And if we have time at the end, I'll give you my beautiful flower analogy if I'm reminded. So, Llewellyn, was there an issue specifically that we wanted to dive in on first, or we want to just go ahead and open up for questions and engagement?
Well, I mean, maybe we should bring to light like a challenge that Visionality has faced in terms of its hiring process, right? So we have, you know, if we were to be currently hiring right now, and a candidate were to be looking into Visionality, researching us online, they will pull up our Teams page and they would see a team that is mostly white, mostly women, and mostly 25 to 40 years old. So in these major categories, we do not have the diversity that our organization truly needs to be successful at the sort of work that we do. We are helping these organizations that are directly supporting our community, and we aren't representing our community in those really important places. And so, and that hasn't been, in the history of Visionality, that hasn't been quite so blatantly true all the time, right? But that is our situation right now. And it's like, how do you break down those barriers to how that looks to a candidate? How do you make those efforts to like gain trust? And this is like exactly the performative versus permanent question.
Yeah, the easiest answer to that is to you know, change the face, change the way that looks, right? And that's ultimately okay. So then what do we do? Like what comes first, the chicken or the egg at this point? Right. So kind of getting over that trust issue. I think a lot of the focus when we're dealing with these issues is what we're not instead of what we are. Mm-hmm. How do you all represent diversity? Do you represent geographic diversity? Do you represent diversity from various, you know, colleges? Diversity from, you know, socioeconomic status? Like thinking beyond just what you can pick up visually for diversity and highlighting the diversity that you do have, I think would be a good step forward. Because that does indicate, for me, when I talk about diversity, for me, the definition is more about covering your blind spot than window dressing and seeing different colors around the table, right? Because I've been in all Black spaces and it's a very diverse space. right? You've got people who come from affluent backgrounds. You've got single parent children. You've got, kids that come from, foster care, like all of these different things. And it's like their perspective is what they're bringing. That's the importance in diversity, is the perspective. Yeah, race, gender, ethnicity, those things inform perspective, but they're not the only things that inform perspective, right? And so making sure that you're able to highlight the diversity that you do have is a good forward step in that, in building that trust. But then again, I think, what's ultimately important is being authentically yourself. There's a Kareem Abdul-Jabbar children's book that I read when I go to schools, and it's called What Color Is Your World? And it explores the world and saying, like, it points out Lewis Latimer. And if you don't know who Lewis Latimer is, well, you wouldn't know who Thomas Edison is if it wasn't for Lewis Latimer, right? And so in this book, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar points out all these various things that are created, or when you look at what your world is, the color of the people who created these things. And so when kind of the root of what color is your world, ultimately, when you're hiring new employees, when you're recruiting to hire new employees, you're relying on your networks. And if your networks are all, when you're asking yourself, what color is my world, and your network reflects an all white world, well, then of course your workplace is going to reflect that as well, right? And so really thinking about, what color is your world? When are you interacting with people that don't look like you? When are you interacting with people who have a different perspective than you? And if the only time you're doing that is in a service relationship, that's a problem. Change that, right? Don't think like, oh yeah, I talked to so-and-so when he checked me out at the Trader Joe's, and that's enough. No. Right. What I'm thinking about is like, okay, so when has someone of a different background sat down on your couch and talked about the things that they care about versus the things you care about, right? And that's how you start, and that's a little far distance from actually hiring, right? Like that's a distance from that, but that's how you populate to get to that end, is that you really take an accounting of what your surrounding looks like and who you're engaging and interacting with, and how you can bolster that to be authentically beneficial to all.
Yeah, and that feels like a moment where like the permanent shows up in a way that would be performative if it wasn't authentic behind the scenes, right? Like, so we make sure that our website shows our affiliations. We make sure that our bios express these parts of our lives. So it's, if it's real behind it, then it's not performative, but otherwise it is.
Yeah, and then you also have to realize that this is a journey. Like you're not gonna, like, you can't stay mission focused on this and expect to get to like victory, right? Because victory changes and it's a moving target. And so I guess the phrase I like to use is manage expectations, and understand that I feel like I'm using a lot of cliches right now, but manage expectations and understand that just because you build it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to come, right? It's not the field of dreams, and you can build it, you can have it on your webpage, and then the 4 people that you interview be like, I never saw that, because they didn't take the care to read it, right? And then that's another thing, right? And so that's another thing, but I wouldn't discount those folks for that, because right now it's an employee's market, right? And so like it's really up to the employer to make sure that you're enticing, attracting diverse talent, but also making sure that you're being authentic about what that workspace is, right? I hate when folks ask me a question that is, I hate when I get asked this question. Hey, I'm going to an interview. What should I, like, do you have any tips for me going to an interview? Like, yes, be yourself. That's the only tip I ever have going to an interview, because if you've got to change who you are to adapt to that space, you don't belong there, right? And then if that, like, that's the mentality that I'm giving to folks of all backgrounds, right? But specifically Black and brown folks, like, you want to be able to show up. What do we show up as your authentic self? When you show up as your authentic self and that environment still embraces you, that's inclusion, right? But we're still just talking about diversity.
Well, and I want to say too, as an employer, I need my applicants to interview me and our company as much as, or more so than I'm interviewing them, because the most catastrophic thing for my organization is turnover. And if you're not able to show up as your full self and be embraced and respected and welcome for who you truly are, you're not going to stay long. And so, like, please do that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I'm curious, James, too, specifically you mentioned if you build it, they may not come. Specifically in our industry, we have a lack of diversity. We pull primarily from individuals who work within nonprofits, and they look like the Visionality team. Individuals who work within nonprofits are typically women. They are typically around our age, and they are typically white. And I know that saying, well, there just isn't diversity in our industry, that we can't stop there. And also, it is a reality. And there have been local and national studies, especially done by AFP, the Association of Fundraising Professionals, that document this lack of diversity in our industry. So talk to me a little bit about that.
Asset framing. I'm going to throw that phrase out there. Asset framing. It's how you look at it. I've attended conferences and had research shared with me that points out that Black folks are the most philanthropic people in our country. Right? Oh my gosh, churches are nonprofits. So have you tapped into that sector? Right? That's where now, of course, those numbers are dwindling, for obvious reasons. But churches are nonprofits, and so you've got folks that operate in those structures that have transitional skills. I know of tons of Black and Brown focused organizations that are nonprofit, the NAACP, there's Links Incorporated, Greek fraternity and sorority organizations, both Black and Brown focused, MABA, all of these organizations, they're nonprofits. Right. And so really changing the way you think of them, the nonprofits that you're connected with, the nonprofits that are savvy enough to seek assistance, right? Because a lot of the nonprofits that I'm affiliated with that are Black and Brown don't know what they don't know. Mm-hmm. They don't know that there's organizations to help you do things, right? And to help you perfect being a nonprofit and allowing you to focus on the work that you do. And I think, making it a strategic step in that direction could be fruitful. But again, it's gonna, that's not a thing where you're gonna, do that next week and then the week after it's gonna, bear fruit. It may not bear fruit for 6 months or a year or longer, right? But it's really about being authentically in those spaces and building relationships. I know that a lot of folks in the Ventura County area get anchored with Ventura County Leadership Academy. And one of the things that's taught through there is relational leadership. Come on, who are your relations? Who are you connected to? And thinking through that is going to be helpful in a lot of that, whether that's clients, whether that's hiring, or whether that's just making friends, right? Like, the world tends to be better when we have friends that expose you to different things. Mm-hmm. I would have never gone, what is that? Skiing on the water, jet skiing? I don't know what it's called. But it's because I hung out with a white dude that ran on my track team, and he was like, hey, come to my cabin with me this weekend. I'm like, all right, sure. So then I get exposed to different things that I otherwise wouldn't have.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I want to talk about the resources that an organization needs to set aside to be deliberate about this and the planning that it needs to take. But I'll just glance at my timer. I know we always try to do these in 25 minutes, and I started mine a little late, but we're at about 9 minutes. So for our hiring process, we always say that your DEI work is not real until it's on your budget as a line item, right?
Yeah.
And so for us, the shape that has taken is that we like everybody else, by the time we need to hire, we needed that person in the seat 3 months ago, and we are urgently needing that person. And yet we have been committed to the investment that it takes to do a longer hiring process to make sure that we give every opportunity to build up a diverse pool of candidates. So that's one thing that we've taken some deliberate steps to do. And then, you know, if someone's going to go to that membership meeting for 6 months or a year, like, you got to plan for the staffing cost of that. And even after a year, when you don't have a result from it, you still got to stick to it. And like, and that is a challenge when the resources feel so tight.
So did you say line item or line items?
Items, yeah, staffing time, membership dues.
Right. So as you're thinking about that, like, diversity inclusion work should be line items, right? So in your thinking, so I don't know specifically, but say you utilize subcontractors to do some of the work for bigger contracts. Where are you sourcing your those subcontractors?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a diversity and inclusion focus in that as well? Because
Mm-hmm.
what that'll do is, at the 3 years down the road, one of those contractors that you work with, it might be looking for a job,
Yeah.
and come back around to someone who they had a good experience with, right?
Yeah.
Thinking about that in your marketing outreach, right? So are you marketing in just nonprofit, or what's the association of nonprofit or fundraising professionals publications, or are you also spreading that money to the Freedom, buying an ad in the NAACP's Freedom Fund banquet, and the Latino Business Expo ad, and those kind of things. And so I kind of say a lot of folks have moved to the, okay, we're going to invest in diversity, inclusion, equity work, and they've made it a line item that sets aside from everything else that they do. The mindset that we should be moving toward is have that included in everything we do, right? So if you've got a food budget, who are your diverse food vendors, right? Like, don't just eat, Chicken Ranch, like, figure out some other folks as well that to spread that money around, and, to increase your taste bud palette. So those are some of the things that I think that could be helpful in the thinking about resources and how to expend those resources, because it shouldn't just be a one-off thing. It should be like, it shouldn't just be a one-off thing. It should be something that's infused in everything that you do, right? I like to point out, I'm not necessarily a religious person myself, but let's just use Christianity. Folks who claim to be Christians go to church on Sunday. But do they stop being Christians when they leave church? They're not supposed to, right? They're supposed to go to church on Sunday, get charged to do the work throughout the rest of the week, right? And so that's what these kinds of conversations are doing, the mindset of not making it just a thing, but making a part of the thing. It is kind of the better direction.
Yeah, and I think the other line item that would need to be addressed is the line item for time for training and onboarding that is sufficient. So if, like, the more specific we get in our job descriptions, for example, when we want not just a project manager anymore, we want a project manager of fundraising, and Visionality is committed to doing mission-driven, Benefon-based fundraising, right? If we can hire someone who knows what all of those words mean already, then we hit the ground running. But if we are going to look at, like pulling from your church example, like the sort of fundraising that happens at a church is not necessarily the sort of fundraising that we're doing. But like, what would it take to train a person up to those, to what is necessary for this particular role?
And I think what would help that would be to understand what are the skill set that they're using in church fundraising that's transitional to what it is that you can use, right?
Yeah.
That concept of transitional skills, I think, is important, particularly when you're looking at diversity. Like, let's utilize Jay-Z as a great example. Admittedly, a street dude, was successful in selling drugs because that was the economic engine that was available to him in his neighborhood, and many, many more. But then look how those skills have transitioned over into the legitimate market, right? He's got all the business acumen from the streets, but it, like, would an executive have made that connection to see the value in that from him? Probably not. But a forward-thinking person very well may see that in other things, like, folks working in various other sectors that could have transitional skills that would be beneficial.
5-minute warning.
I did see a question in the chat about nonprofit salaries as a barrier to diversity and inclusion. I think it's less about the actual salaries and more about the perception of the salaries. My understanding of the nonprofit sector is that salaries are actually better than what you probably think. You can make, sustain and make a living working for a nonprofit, or working for nonprofits and doing nonprofit work. And I think, it's usually like the higher levels, like the executive directors and the development directors and things of that nature. But exposing folks who may not even know that those are job possibilities, exposing folks to that stuff is I think, your pipeline, right? You got to work your way up in any industry.
And in terms of if you build it, they will come. Last year, Visionality implemented health benefits for the first time. We had a hiring process in works, and it was not generating the candidates that we were looking for, and we paused it. And we spent 4 months implementing health benefits, and we reposted, and we built it, and we waited for them to come, and it did not change the candidate pool. It was just a moment of total humbling for us, of like, we thought we had a key here. And maybe that's because the job market is so strange right now. Maybe because, I don't know, but it was an interesting lesson for us.
Yeah. And Sharon, thank you for that comment. My fellow VCLAer, talking about degree requirements for jobs that don't really need to be, need is a huge barrier. And experience and entrepreneurial spirit should be acceptable criteria, and I think that kind of harkens back to the, a more ground level for Jay-Z. We're not all going to become billionaires. But yeah, no, those are solid.
So we're at about time. Our commitment to y'all is a big topic within 25 minutes. So I want to open it up to everybody for questions. Put it in the chat. Come on camera, unmute yourself if that's comfortable for you. I see my friend Judy's here as well. She says in the chat, nonprofits often attract entrepreneurs and entrepreneurial skills. I completely agree with you, and Sharon agreed. I would much work experience and a figure it out kind of spirit is so valuable.
What if nonprofits did something similar to some of these larger corporate companies? I know that there's a financial investment in this, but I've seen some companies that, mid to large size tech companies, they'll have incubators for their employees, right? So if you have an entrepreneurial bug or have an idea, there's a venue to kind of cook it and work it out within the structure of that. That's an idea that I've seen be successful, but it's a commitment.
What other questions? Yeah, Judy, what you got?
Good morning. I think this is related, but maybe kind of on the other side of the organizational question. So I'm a consultant and a coach and a facilitator in the mainly in the nonprofit sector. And James, I heard you speak to something that I've been thinking a lot about, which is, organizations who might not be thinking about where are their opportunities for them to have the support of consultative services. Both to grow their organization, to look at supporting their leaders, to move forward and gain skills. And so I'm curious about that, like as a business model, like how to go about identifying or creating a marketing message that attracts organizations to be able to see for themselves that there are services that could help them expand.
I'm thinking of oh my gosh, I can't think of the name. It was several years ago. So I'm on a national board of a nonprofit called Student African American Brotherhood, and it's primarily focused on, academic and professional success for African American men through, college and into career. Several years ago, I mean, we've been an organization for 35 plus years, but there was this stagnation in our organization. We were getting grant funding, like the Lumina Foundation gave us funding, or these different foundations gave us funding. But then what do? Well, we realized as a board member, it's like, well, our director, our executive director doesn't have a marketing presence. And so there was this kind of Craigslist-like type organization that you could go to, and basically people who provided services put their services on this site, and then organizations who needed those services could go on there, and basically these people would provide pro bono services to nonprofits in order to help them scale up. But a lot of that we didn't even know that existed until we had a consultant come in, tell us about this thing, and said that this is something that's available to you. So I bring that example up for really thinking about like the things that are out there. You don't have to recreate the wheel. That there are vehicles out there to kind of help folks know and expose to that, and use that as the entry point, right? If utilize that, like if they, we had worked with a marketing agency out of New York, and we were based in Ohio at the time. And so, like, yeah, we were working with this person who had the goodwill and the good heart, but they weren't on the ground and knowing the work that we were doing, intimately. And so I bring that up to kind of say that if you can help introduce something that will benefit you down the road, it'll kind of get that thought process working, right? And so they'll see, like, these organizations that may not know that these resources are available to them, they'll start to see the value in reaching out for these resources. And then when they realize that your value, you'll be there, right? Because you're the one that helped them think down that process.
Well, and James, you gave Visionality that opportunity. Do you remember when you connected us with NAACP Ventura County? You were moderating a forum for them, and it was in the height of the pandemic, and you gave us the opportunity to do some pro bono work for them in running their Zoom. And it was such an eye-opener for me on how, as a company, we can have real effect in offering pro bono services, because it's truly just very cost effective for me. So it's not that I have to earn the money to give the money. It's just like, no, I've already invested in my team. We already know how to do this really well. It will take this much effort for us to support this organization with this much impact. And it was just such a gift. And so that's something that we're working into our cash flow and staffing plans is, when I step back to plan the year, it's, what organizations do we want to invest in? What kind of profit do we need to make so that we can have those investments? What is the implication on our staffing if I want to make my team available in that kind of area? And it's just been really impactful to be like, oh, this is a very easy way for us to plug in and, again, build organizations up at a foundational level.
Indeed, and I appreciate you bringing that up, because there's an additional level to that instead of thinking of it in pro bono, it's a partnership, right? Whereas, absolutely, something like the NAACP, they do, like I mentioned, the Freedom Fund banquet every year, and they're always going to the Black organizations to sell ads in their program, and it's like, that's great, but how do you expand that to, like, have your impact be felt throughout the community? Right. And so, like, yeah, it's great to know that I can go to that Freedom Fund Bank program, look in there, I'm like, oh, these are the Black businesses, essentially, right? But how do we get that crossover to happen? Well, instead of saying we're going to do it for free, hey, NAACP, I know that you have this Freedom Fund banquet. How much would a half-page ad in your program be? Look, we're willing to do that amount of work, double that amount of work for you throughout the year and doing these various things, but we just want to make sure that we have a presence in there, right? That's saving on marketing dollars, or maybe it zeroes out. But I mean, thinking creatively, like that's a little bit of, what do they call that, creative budgeting.
Yeah. Yeah. What other questions do people have, or successes that you want to share with the group, or struggles that you're in the midst of? We're here to workshop things and celebrate if you've got some good things going on.
Please.
Yeah.
Thank you. No, I'm really enjoying this, and I'd love some guidance. One kind of thing I struggle with is a little bit back to what you're talking about, but budget. DEI as integrated and everywhere, but totally separate, and we're accountable for it. Like that. So everywhere, and anyway, so I struggle with that as a concept, and I'd love any guidance you might have on that as a concept, as a like, no. Here's like, I hear the journey, I hear start where you are, recognize where you are, but there are a lot of different steps you could take in any particular order, and I'm aware of that too.
Again, I'll lean back on asset framing. You know, within any company, money is everywhere, and you're held accountable to that, right? And you know, like, that's the bottom line. You know, how close are these diversity, inclusion, and equity issues to the bottom line for you, right? For your organization. And you know, really thinking of it that way can be helpful. But you're right, like you can't just like, oh, it's a part of everything, and so we're not going to be held accountable to it. There's a lot of metrics that are being developed, and kind of there's some that have been out there and tested and proven, and you know, there's definitely some tips that you can, you know, that are out there to kind of make things better, but ultimately it comes down to the culture. And so, you know, what's been interesting to me over the past, particularly 2 to 3 years, is seeing the growth of the language of people and culture in companies, right? And it really, like, yeah, they were moving towards people and culture, but then that became much more of a thing when we wanted to focus on diversity and inclusion. It's like, yeah, people and culture, we need to include that in that, instead of just human resources, right? And the language really matters when you hear it, and particularly when you're the recipient of that language. So yeah, I think that some of that, I guess some of that recommendation is language. The other part is asset framing, and thinking about how, you know, how is it infused in all of those things. Does that answer your question, or did I kind of meander on a soapbox?
No, that was that was good, because that was a poorly framed question to begin with. So I think that, but I do want to follow up. I do want to follow up then and ask about those metrics you mentioned, or those things, and more about people culture. I feel very exposed. My title got changed about people and culture about 2 years ago. So I'm feeling quite
okay.
Sorry.
I want, before you answer that question, James, I just want to like jump in on this people and culture, human resources thing, because we're a team of 7 right now. We're a small team, and I represent human resources, right? But my title is operations manager, and it used to be only Emily and I, and we all just do everything that needs to get done. And now we're big enough to allocate into these different categories. And I think that it's interesting, you know, we've been doing Building Forward for a while, and this is my first Building Forward because I'm on the internal side of the business, but this topic brings in a different segment of an organization, and it may not be like a segment that is as used to being in front of the camera talking about things, right? But it's a really interesting thing to consider, the fact that, like, how do you make these significant changes in your organization if you don't actually have every level of the org chart on board in some way? And that, I think, is perhaps a way to frame, like, how do you allocate the resources? Well, you can't just say, like, let's get our CEO out there networking and then be done. I think you have to think about how to make sure that everyone feels like part of the process and is invested in that process in some way.
Right. So some companies, what they'll do is they'll encourage their employees to make donations to nonprofits by saying that they'll match that donation, right? Matching donations. And so Creative little programs like that can be helpful to get everybody to buy it. I'm trying to think of create one here on the top of my head, right? So say we'll, as an organization, we'll pay for, so some organizations, they'll pay for if you're an attorney, they'll pay for you to your bar fees every year, because that's a benefit to the business, right? So what if the business paid for your annual membership to a professional organization or a community nonprofit or something, or something like that. So say that one of your employees was like, they're interested in bird watching and they want to join like some Audubon society. And instead of doing just an Audubon society, well, how about we do the minority focused Audubon society and make ourselves uncomfortable and expose ourselves to a different group of people? Like, yeah, that's a personal passion of mine, but that connection, that network is going to benefit the company. Maybe. If it does directly benefit the company, great. If it doesn't directly benefit the company, it benefits the company by investing in my people and the things that my people are passionate about, right? But in that extra level of encouraging your people to be passionate in an area that they're not normally comfortable, but right? Like I've heard people talk about Comic-Con and how Comic-Con is probably the most accepting environment that they've ever been in, because people from all backgrounds, they're there just because we're all weird. We're here because we have this common theme of being weird. I don't care what color you are. I don't care where you come from. I care that costume is dope, right? And so when you have that common bond or that common tie beyond the thing, the diversity, the inclusion, all of that, like that's the authenticity. That's what takes you beyond performance.
Catherine, I think I usurped your second question though. Can you say it again?
Okay, it's a cheap question, but you did mention metrics, so I wanted to know like what matters.
Yeah, so I mean that largely, I'm a fan of encouraging organizations to align metrics with your mission and vision, right? If it's not in your mission and vision, why are you measuring it, right? And so then that also makes you think, well, then if we haven't included inclusion exclusively in our mission or vision, do we really care about it, right? And so, there's I know that the independent schools, they use there's something called an inclusion dashboard. And so for these schools, like there's a series of metrics that they utilize to say, okay, how are we doing as it comes to inclusion, right? That they're at that similar. I've seen that there's a dashboard that for some reason craft breweries have, there's a network of craft breweries that have embarked on this diversity and inclusion work, and there's a dashboard that they utilize, right? And so within professional organizations, there's organizations that are developing these things and or have utilized them to be developed or utilized them and kind of been perfecting them over the years. None are popping to the top of my head right now as far as names or anything of that nature, but there are some metrics out there. But again, they're to be utilized as models, not blueprints.
Yeah, I feel like metrics is where the conversation sometimes becomes the most uncomfortable and leads to some of the worst like successes that are not successes.
Right.
And yeah, that it's just it's hard for people to talk about metrics without them feeling like they're talking about their current or future team members as numbers. But I agree in the power of, if you're not quantifying something, then how are you working towards it? How are you being specific about that goal?
You know what's another metric? How many positive stories have been shared? Right? How much positive feedback? How much negative feedback? Like stories are part, like that builds that narrative. Essentially what metrics are, they're just numbers to tell a story. So if you can find another way to tell a story beyond just numbers, like, yeah, you've got to utilize numbers, but say, these numbers need to be backed up by, so I think Emily and Llewellyn are aware. Last week I did a presentation on mental illness, did a speech on that. And the speech that followed mine, like I was anchored in very much individualized stories, but the speech that followed mine was a woman that came in and talked about numbers. And she was like, you know, in a county of Santa Barbara, say, like, I think 35,000 people have been identified with a, you know, mental illness. And it's like, that's a large number. But then when you connect that number to the stories that were shared, and then the stories that came after that, being able to have those numbers and contextualize those numbers and make them human, I think is like a better way to think about utilizing metrics.
And also remembering that there is no finish line.
No.
Yeah.
Good. Thank you, Catherine.
Great question.
I remember we had a big aha moment within our company where we created a list of our values and went over those values with our whole team. And I remember having this aha moment within some of our team members where they, you know, we were very clear what our values are, and then challenged them to find ways that they can personally touch our values, and helping them understand that each of these values is each of our jobs every single day. And one of those values is building up DEIJ within our organizations and within our clients. So it's two questions for us. It's, what does the diversity and inclusion on our team look like? But so that's great. That's my job and that's Llewellyn's job. But for our project managers, it's also their job to build that up in their own clients. And so they just had this big epiphany of like, oh, wait, this is not just about us. This is where we get to bring our company values into our organizations to help make them more resilient.
And then I think from there, it became a question in our first level of screening for candidates of how can you contribute to our DEIJ work, of like, is this going to be something that is important to you if you join our team?
Well, and screening of our potential clients too. Like we have now crossed that Rubicon where we're not taking every client. We are only taking clients who align with our values. And that was just such a huge, like, scarcity, abundance, like, this is, our values have become non-negotiable in all pieces of the work that we touch.
So what you all are just talking about is essentially a language audit. So Catherine, back to your question, that's a metric, right? So has your organization done a language audit of the language on the webpage, the brochures, the outreach for job descriptions, all of that kind of stuff, and make sure that that language is tuned with your vision, your mission and vision, as well as the focus on the additional things that you care about, the diversity, the inclusion, the equity.
Yeah. Judy coming in with another banger. So her question, and Judy, I love this because I asked this exact question when we were doing our prep last week. So Judy asks, how are white people welcomed at organizations centering leaders of color? Are there places for white individuals to recognize and step back? And
you want to answer this for me, Emily?
No, I want you to tell everyone what you told me.
Yeah, I think that this is a thing about reverse engineering, right? Like, let me rephrase that question. How am I, as a Black person, welcomed at organizations centering people that don't look like me? Right? That's the question of my life. That's the question of the life of every Black person, every brown person trying to navigate white America, right? And so utilize that as a model, learn from it. Again, not a blueprint, but a model. There's like, being white in America affords you this privilege of comfortability. There's this privilege that I go to the grocery store, I'm comfortable. Well, I mean, with guns now, that's all questionable, but you know, generally speaking, it's like, that's a comfortable environment. That alone me is anxiety driven. Because when I look around, it's like, oh, there's 3 other Black people in the store. right? Like we make eye contact, we nod, but there's nobody welcoming us in that environment. You're not necessarily going to be welcomed in that environment. Now, let me tell you, what I know about my people is because we have been on the other end of that, when we see someone in our environment that's not normally there and we see that uncomfortability and fidgety, somebody within that structure is more likely to make an outreach. It's empathy, right? When you can empathize with how another person is feeling and what another person is going through, and you can help them through that. Don't expect it, but understand that it's likely to happen. And so, like, yeah, there's a tap dance that you have to play when you're entering spaces that are, you know, essentially designated for people of color.
Mm-hmm. Well,
doesn't mean don't go.
And it was so funny because I was just like, you said, well, like there are, you know, a Black professionals network of Santa Barbara or something like that, and I was like, I can go to that, and you're like, yeah, dude, just show up. And Llewellyn, if you're comfortable sharing out, I don't know if you remember, but you had some really interesting insight on building trust in that process. Do you remember what we talked about?
Yeah, definitely. And I guess I am a little uncomfortable sharing it because I feel like it's like holding it up next to your experience, James, and it's not the same as your experience.
No, it's from your perspective.
So my perspective on the situation is that I feel like I am the person who recognizes the person who's uncomfortable and uses empathy to connect. And I think that being an instinct for me is a result of a lot of things about, I grew up in South Oxnard in a neighborhood where we were one of the only white families. I've had all these different experiences where I've actually been accustomed to being the only white person in a room. I will say quite honestly that when I moved to the house where we live in right now in North Oxnard and we had white neighbors, I thought it was weird. I'm not joking. I thought it was really weird. And so I guess it's just, I always feel jumbled up in my brain and in my heart in these conversations a lot because it's like, from a first glance, I'm just another white person in the room of white people contributing to the uncomfortableness of the Black or brown person in the room. But I feel like there's so much more to it there for me that's like packed into it.
And Llewellyn, I'd venture to say that if before we had connected, if I saw you in a room, I could get that sense. I may not know the whole story, but I could probably pick up like, oh, she's cool people, right? That's probably the language that we would utilize, like, oh, that's cool people, like, and understanding like, you probably understand more than what you do, than what it appears that you do, right? And you know, hearing you share that just now, I was thinking back, like how I was trying to like deconstruct. How would I know that? I don't know. Like I don't know how I can explain to you how I would pick up on that. But
yeah.
One way could be, well, when I'm in a room and I'm the only one, and no one decides to make eye contact with me or even speak, it's a little weird.
Yeah.
Right. So when you see that, like sometimes a smile and a hello goes so far.
Yeah. And I think if I bring that into the conversation about me being a person who has hired for Visionality for all these years, it's like, I don't feel like I have any success so far in communicating that to a candidate until the moment that I'm on a Zoom interview with them. And then I feel like we can get that connection and on some level. But in terms of attracting the candidate to us, I don't have that success yet. And that's where these tactics that we're talking about today come in. That's where do I need to be out in the community doing that?
Well, and the other thing that we talked about was that we're building relationships every day. And that's where where this goes from performative to permanent. It's like, no, Emily, it wasn't sufficient for you to join NAACP Ventura County. Like, that's not enough. Like, are you showing up to the meetings? Are you continuing to build relationships? And we had talked too about like this this need to build that trust in order to open those doors. And there is just an inherent distrust when I show up in a room of people who don't look like me. Why are you here? And needing to have that time to establish a relationship so that the door becomes open. Why are you here?
Mm-hmm.
But you know what makes it much easier to answer that question of why you're here? When you enter that room and someone like, you know, the president Regina says, oh, this is Emily from Visionality who helped us out with XYZ. If you all remember that event and how smooth that went, right? You know, it's that experience. Having that experience helps validate and create credibility and experience and consistency.
Right. What else? Any other questions or feedback or successes or struggles?
Nothing's off limits. This is your opportunity.
Yep. Well, maybe we've done it.
We solved it. Good.
Yes, done. All right, everyone. I want to thank each of you for showing up and being uncomfortable and being vulnerable and feeling something with us. And I want to thank my friend Llewellyn for getting out of her comfort zone and co-hosting, being my co-star on this. I really appreciate you. And James, I'm so glad I get to work alongside you. Thank you for sharing. Yes.
The flower.
Oh, the flower.
The flower. You got to talk about the flower. So the flower is kind of what you know, when we talk about getting uncomfortable, think about a flower. We're all flowers, right? And we love the end result of a flower. We like the rose. We like to see the beautiful colors. We like to smell it. But what we don't know about that when we engage the flower is the journey that flower took, right? And that flower had to go through a lot of uncomfortability to become that beautiful thing that it is. It started off as a seed or a bulb. As I've been directed, I do have a little bit of a green thumb, but as a seed or a bulb, right? And then in order to start to become a flower, it's got to go through a frictionless, uncomfortable act of cracking through the seed or the bulb to sprout. And then as it's sprouting, yeah, it's green, it's not ugly per se, but that's not the beautiful thing that you think about. Like, you think about the flower. But as it's unfolding and doing this thing called growing and getting new leaves and all the things that it needs to do to prepare in order to bloom, that's uncomfortable. The flower probably doesn't feel good about having to like unfold and stretch out its leaves. As a flower, that's probably like some growing pains, right? And so that's what we're going through. We think about us, particularly as we're looking at better racial understanding as flowers and trying to get to something, but understanding that it takes a journey of uncomfortability to get there. I think it'll ease us into it a little bit better.
I love it. All right, everyone. Thank you all so much. We'll be back this time next month. Please let us know what topics you'd like to cover. We're always looking for co-stars, so please email me. If you have something to share, please email me and let's have a good conversation about it. I appreciate each of you. Go make the world a better place.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye, everyone.